President Volodymyr Zelensky's recent statements signal a significant turning point in Ukraine's military and political strategy. Since the beginning of the war, Ukraine's approach has been largely defensive, focused on protecting its cities, regaining lost territories, and maintaining international support. But Zelensky's latest remarks reveal a more confident and assertive tone, one that suggests Ukraine is no longer content with merely resisting aggression, but is now preparing to strike back directly at its source. His words carry both symbolic and strategic weight, aimed at sending a message to Moscow that Ukraine is capable of expanding the battlefield beyond its own borders if necessary. This bold stance reflects how Ukraine's resilience, battlefield experience, and access to advanced Western weapons have gradually shifted the balance of power. Over the past months, Kyiv has improved its drone technology and precision strike capabilities, enabling it to reach deep into Russian territory. Zelensky's tone also serves a psychological purpose: to inspire Ukrainians, warn Russia, and remind the world that Ukraine's fight for sovereignty is far from over. The message is clear. If Russia continues its attacks on Ukrainian cities, no part of Russian territory will be guaranteed safety. This new level of confidence might redefine the war's dynamics in the months ahead. Reports emerging from multiple sources suggest that Ukraine is actively preparing for long-range strikes deep into Russian territory. These operations would go beyond border skirmishes or drone raids and could target critical Russian infrastructure such as command posts, fuel depots, supply hubs, and transportation networks. The goal would be to disrupt the logistics that sustain Russia's war machine and weaken its operational capabilities. Ukraine has already demonstrated the potential for such missions through several recent drone attacks on Russian oil facilities and military airfields hundreds of kilometers away. If Zelensky's latest comments are any indication, Kyiv may be planning to intensify this strategy, not as random acts of retaliation, but as part of a calculated campaign to erode Russia's war endurance. Deep strikes could also serve to expose vulnerabilities within Russia's defense systems and create psychological pressure on the Kremlin, whose citizens have so far been insulated from the direct effects of war. However, this escalation carries risks. A large-scale Ukrainian offensive inside Russia could provoke unpredictable retaliation, including cyber attacks or intensified missile barrages on Ukrainian cities. Still, many in Kyiv believe that taking the fight to Russia might be the only way to change the course of this prolonged conflict. As Ukraine's ambitions expand, questions arise about how far its Western allies are willing to go in supporting such bold actions. The United States, United Kingdom, and several NATO members have provided Ukraine with advanced weaponry, intelligence, and financial aid. However, they have also imposed strict limitations on how those weapons can be used, especially when it comes to striking targets inside Russia. Western leaders fear that direct attacks on Russian soil could trigger a dangerous escalation, potentially drawing NATO into a broader confrontation with Moscow. Zelensky's latest hints, therefore, present a delicate challenge for the West. On one hand, Ukraine's allies understand the logic of taking the war to the aggressor. On the other, they must balance their support with the constant need to avoid global instability. Despite these constraints, there are signs that the West's stance may be slowly evolving. Some reports indicate that American and European policymakers are becoming more open to allowing Ukraine limited deep strikes, particularly against Russian military targets, directly involved in the ongoing assault. Zelensky's rhetoric might also be intended to test this boundary, to see how far the West's tolerance extends. As diplomatic talks continue, one thing is clear. Ukraine's next steps will depend not only on its own capabilities, but also on how much freedom its partners are willing to grant it on the battlefield. Moscow has reacted sharply to Zelensky's warning, issuing firm threats that any Ukrainian strikes inside Russian territory will be treated as acts of terrorism supported by the West. Kremlin spokespersons have accused NATO of pushing Ukraine toward escalation, claiming that such actions could justify a stronger Russian military response. Behind these words, however, lies genuine concern. Russian defense systems have struggled to stop Ukrainian drones even in regions far from the front lines, exposing serious gaps in air defense coverage. If Ukraine begins to target deeper Russian regions, such as Belgorod, Kursk, or even Moscow's industrial centers, Russia may feel pressured to retaliate in unpredictable ways. This could include intensifying missile strikes on Ukrainian cities or deploying new types of long-range weapons. For the Russian public, attacks within their own territory could also break the illusion that the war is distant and under control. This psychological shift could challenge the Kremlin's domestic narrative, which portrays the conflict as a defensive operation limited to Ukraine. Still, Russia's military and political leadership have made it clear they will not tolerate continued strikes on their soil. Zelensky's statement, therefore, has not only escalated military tensions, but also ignited a fierce propaganda battle over who holds the moral high ground in this war. Zelensky's bold declaration could redefine the next phase of the war. For nearly 3 years, the conflict has revolved around territorial gains, defensive lines, and counteroffensives. But the possibility of Ukraine launching deep strikes into Russia introduces an entirely new dimension, a psychological and strategic confrontation that could change how both armies plan their operations. Deep strikes would allow Ukraine to weaken Russia's infrastructure, stretch its defense resources, and create confusion in its command chain. This could open opportunities for smaller tactical advances on the front lines. However, the move also comes with high risks. If Ukraine escalates too far, it could face greater resistance not just from Russia, but from hesitant Western allies wary of provoking nuclear threats. The next phase will thus depend heavily on how calculated Ukraine's strikes are. Precise enough to weaken Russia's war capacity, but measured enough to avoid uncontrollable escalation. For Ukraine, success would mean shifting the war's momentum and proving that it can shape the battlefield on its own terms. For Russia, it would be a wake-up call that its vast geography is no longer an impenetrable shield. The coming months will show whether Zelensky's warning was a signal of strategic confidence or a high-stakes gamble in a war that is constantly evolving. Zelensky's bold warning has sparked intense debate across the world. Some nations and analysts view his statement as a natural evolution of Ukraine's defense, a move born from necessity after enduring relentless Russian bombardments. Others, however, warn that striking inside Russia could trigger an uncontrollable chain of retaliation. The United Nations and major European capitals have urged both sides to show restraint. But there's an underlying understanding that Ukraine's patience is wearing thin. Global media outlets have framed the warning as a moment of truth. Will Ukraine expand the war, or is this a calculated act of deterrence aimed at making Russia reconsider its offensives? In Washington and Brussels, policymakers are weighing the risks of escalation against the moral and strategic imperative of helping Ukraine defend itself. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the statement has been used to rally nationalist sentiment and justify further militarization. Looking ahead, the world is bracing for a critical few months. If Zelensky follows through on his hint, we could see the conflict move into unprecedented territory, where long-range strikes and psychological warfare define the battlefield. But if his message succeeds in deterring further Russian aggression without escalation, it could be remembered as a strategic masterstroke, a warning that changed the war's course without a single missile launched. Either way, the world is watching closely, and history is being written in real time.